the nominee is Donald Trump. How big of a concern is that for the Trump campaign?
Well, it's great to be with you this morning. In fact, CBS News exit polling reveals new information about just this question. In fact, in North Carolina, for example, about 80%, 78% to be exact, of Nikki Haley supporters say they would have reservations about supporting the nominee if it were someone other than Nikki Haley, including former President Donald Trump. That means for the Trump campaign, there's a lot of work to do in making inroads with traditional Republicans, Haley supporters, as they move toward this general election campaign against President Biden. Because if they ignore the Haley coalition in any way, thinking they don't really need to make an overture to those voters, well, the Biden campaign is certainly going to make an effort to win over those Haley supporters.
All right. We're going to cut into you, Robert, because Nikki Haley has taken the podium.
Just over a year ago, I launched my campaign for president. When I began, I said the campaign was grounded in my love for our country. Just last week, my mother, a first-generation immigrant, got to vote for her daughter for president. Only in America. I am filled with the gratitude for the outpouring of support we've received from all across our great country. But the time has now come to suspend my campaign. I said I wanted Americans to have their voices heard. I have done that. I have no regrets. And although I will no longer be a candidate, I will not stop using my voice for the things I believe in. Our national debt will eventually crush our economy. A smaller federal government is not only necessary for our freedom, it is necessary for our survival. The road to socialism is the road to ruin for America. Our Congress is dysfunctional and only getting worse. It is filled with followers, not leaders. Term limits for Washington politicians are needed now more than ever. Our world is on fire because of America's retreat. Standing by our allies in Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan is a moral imperative. But it's also more than that. If we retreat further, there will be more war, not less. As important, while we stand strong for the cause of freedom, we must bind together as Americans. We must turn away from the darkness of hatred and division. I will continue to promote all those values, as is the right of every American. I sought the honor of being your president. But in our great country, being a private citizen is privilege enough in itself. And that's a privilege I very much look forward to enjoying. In all likelihood, Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee when our party convention meets in July. I congratulate him and wish him well. I wish anyone well who would be America's president. Our country is too precious to let our differences divide us. I have always been a conservative Republican and always supported the Republican nominee. But on this question, as she did on so many others, Margaret Thatcher provided some good advice when she said, quote, "Never just follow the crowd. Always make up your own mind." It is now up to Donald Trump to earn the votes of those in our party and beyond it who did not support him. And I hope he does that. At its best, politics is about bringing people into your cause, not turning them away. And our conservative cause badly needs more people. This is now his time for choosing. I end my campaign with the same words I began it, from the book of Joshua. I direct them to all Americans, but especially to so many of the women and girls out there who put their faith in our campaign. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for God will be with you wherever you go. In this campaign, I have seen our country's greatness. From the bottom of my heart, thank you, America. God bless you.
All right, there we heard from Nikki Haley officially suspending her campaign. Going to go back to Robert Costa. We knew that we weren't going to hear an endorsement for President Trump, but I'm curious about what you thought about this speech. I feel like she sort of really underlined her traditional conservative values: small debt, small government, term limits, the regular old boring stuff that we used to hear from conservatives.
For Nikki Haley, this was the end of a campaign, but it was not the end of her role in conservative politics nationwide. In her short remarks this morning, she outlined how she believes she was an advocate for traditional Republican values, and she wants to continue to be in the political arena, making the case for everything you just outlined: the traditional Republican way of looking at foreign policy, supporting Ukraine, being averse to Vladimir Putin and Russia, having strong allies in the NATO community, having a strong, muscular U.S. presence in the world when it comes to the military and national security, and on domestic policy, being for a smaller government, not necessarily an expanded state. Listen to who she cited in this brief speech: Margaret Thatcher, the former late British Prime Minister, a hero to many conservatives around the world for how she revolutionized the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And for Nikki Haley, this is a crossroads, but now she has some political capital after being the last one remaining against former President Donald Trump. She knows Trump has not reached out to her in any significant way asking for her endorsement, did not mention her in his remarks last night at Mar-a-Lago. And now she said straight to Trump today, "You're going to have to earn my vote, earn the vote in support of my coalition around the country." And for Trump, it's going to be a difficult task. Does he really want to make the effort overtly to win over Nikki Haley or not? It's not really in his style to do that. But politically speaking, he might just have to.
I was going to say, it's not only is it not in his style, but thus far, he really hasn't had to, in that he's been winning, right? And even when you listen to his speech last night, it was very reminiscent, I thought, of his speech after when he was sworn in as president. This focus on how dark and terrible things are. It felt like what was old is new again, in a way. But you're right. She talked about politics is about bringing people together, and that the conservative cause needs more people under that tent, and that's very true. I wonder, though, how important will these Nikki supporters be? I mean, Donald Trump seems to have retained support from a lot of those sort of suburban women, but you would know better than me that she might have appealed to. If he just disregards the Nikki Haley coalition, I mean, who are they going to vote for?
It's an open political question. And Haley represents a certain kind of Republican going back to President Ronald Reagan. And after Reagan was elected in 1980, for over 3 decades, the Reagan-type Republican dominated GOP politics. You had his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and then H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, become president. You had Republicans who believed in Reagan politics being at the fore of the party. And that continued even into the congressional ranks with people like Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, who's now heading for the exits from the leadership himself. And what last night's results showed Nikki Haley and so many others in her wing of the party is, while they still have a wing of the party, they in no way have a powerful wing. Now, that doesn't mean it could shift back. The whole power dynamic in the party could shift back toward Haley and her wing at some point. But for now, with Trump looking at the nomination for a 3rd time, this is a historic moment, because it's very rare for someone to win a nomination 3 times. Think about Richard Nixon winning the nomination in 60, 68, 72, being on the vice presidential ticket twice. Trump is now in that league of someone who really has a shadow over a party for so long. And Haley and her coalition, they might just need to sit it out for a cycle or 2, but at the same time, they're trying to have an influence, even as they know Trump has such widespread influence over the direction of policy, but not just policy, the culture of the party. Yeah. You see a relic of traditional conservatism within a Trump party.
That's so true. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Trump's speech, because I didn't get a chance to talk to you last night because I was asleep. So I do want to get your take on Donald Trump's speech. You know, often at this point in a campaign, this is when you may hear a candidate pivot a little, going from, you know, what they would have said during the primary when they're kind of duking it out with other candidates to pivoting to November. But I feel like there's no pivot here with Donald Trump. But like I said, it sounded an awful lot like the speech that we heard, you know, when he first embarked on the presidency. And he used a lot of the same language, in particular talking about how dark things are. He called this country a third world country at the border and a third world country when it comes to our elections, which is not true. And he also went back to this attack on the news. You recall he was the one that called the media the enemy of the people. He didn't say that, but he certainly suggested that the news is responsible for the divisions. Like, what did you make of this speech? Who was he talking to? What was he hoping to accomplish?
One longtime Trump advisor, his former campaign manager, Brad Parscale, once said in the wake of the 2020 election when Trump was defeated, even though he falsely claims he won, that Parscale said privately, if Trump runs again, he's going to run for one reason: vengeance. Vengeance will be the piston behind the Trump campaign that powers it forward. And you see now in his speech on Super Tuesday, not so much an ideological agenda he's laying out for the country, but a revival of the political paradigm he introduced in 2015-2016. American carnage, he called it in his 2017 inaugural address, painting the country with a broad brush in a dire way, saying crime's running rampant in the streets, the borders are insecure, people feel very unhappy about the economy. And instead of having many people up on stage with him last night, as he has done in previous contests, what did we see last night? We saw Trump alone. Trump alone on stage. And what does that remind us of?
Only
I alone can fix it.
Yes.
I alone can fix it, as he famously said, or infamously said, according to whether you ask a critic or a supporter of Trump. The context always matters in that sense. But we're looking now at Trump going back to his 2016 playbook. And instead of running against Secretary Clinton, he's running against President Biden in the same way. And he's not trying to push the GOP in a totally new direction. He's saying Biden has failed in his view and that the president should be beaten and let Trump come back into power. And the challenge for Trump is he's not the same candidate he was in 2016. He was a total outsider in 2016. Now he's someone who's already had the presidency. And he had a role in January 6th in leading a pressure campaign on former Vice President Pence and many others to overturn the election that still sits in the mind of many voters, including many Nikki Haley supporters I've met on the campaign trail who remain unsettled about Trump's conduct, his character, even if they support his policies.
That's such a good observation. We keep calling this a rematch because I guess it's kind of the best phrase to use. But in actuality, yes, the same two names are on the ballot, but so much is different. The country is different. These two men are different. Now they both have records that they're running on. As you point out, Donald Trump has a record too. And President Biden, you know, when he was elected, we were craving normalcy. I don't know what's normal anymore. I don't think anyone knows what's normal anymore in politics. So, Bob, well, I know we're going to be talking a lot between now and November. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring in CBS News campaign reporter Olivia Rinaldi. She's in West Palm Beach, Florida, a home of the former President Donald Trump. So what have we heard thus far from the Trump campaign?
Yeah, good morning, Emery. Just before Nikki Haley took the stage, Donald Trump put out a post on Truth Social. That's his social media platform. I'm going to read it to you now, where he says Nikki Haley got trounced last night in record-setting fashion, despite the fact that Democrats, for unknown reasons, are allowed to vote in Vermont and various other Republican primaries. Vermont is an open primary. They were allowed to vote in that. He then goes on to say that most of her money came from, quote, radical left Democrats, as did her voters. And this is interesting. He says, at this point, I hope she stays in the quote, quote, race and fights it out until the end. Then he goes on to thank his family and friends. But then he said he would further invite all Haley supporters to join his movement in the greatest movement he calls in the history of the nation, then calls Biden the enemy and says he's destroying the country. So this is the first response we have heard from Donald Trump on the news that Nikki Haley is dropping out. And to Bob's point earlier about the Haley coalition of voters, the people who are disenfranchised with Trump, it is this type of rhetoric and behavior that they find difficult to stomach, to then bring them back over to the Republican Party to vote for Trump and the MAGA movement. So very interesting rhetoric from him this morning already on that notion. But to some other point about how Trump is viewing this race, for months now, the Trump campaign has been telling us that it's a two-man race and it's between him and Biden. They have already been focused as a general election race, probably since about January, honestly, right after the Iowa caucus. They said it's time for everyone to drop out, coalesce around Trump, let's get this party together and start facing Joe Biden. It seems like now, 2 months later, about 2 months later, that is finally coming to fruition where Donald Trump can make that pivot towards the general election and focusing on Biden himself.
Yeah, you reading that tweet or post, whatever you call it these days, I was definitely having flashbacks of sort of breathlessly covering a lot of his tweets while he was president. And you're right, it sounds really similar to days gone by. The question is, if Nikki Haley supporters are exhausted with this kind of behavior, what is their alternative at this point, right? It's either to vote Democrat, not vote at all, or vote for the guy that they poured a lot, that they hoped they would not be seeing ever again on the campaign trail. Olivia, thank you very much. Americans are facing the rising cost of medical services. So after the break, rapper Chuck D is going to be joining me to discuss his efforts for more transparency on pricing from hospitals and healthcare companies. We'll be right back.
Mr. President, there's a lot to talk about.
A lot.